And to start our proceedings, I'm delighted to welcome the director of the Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy, Geoffrey Cowan.
I named myself after this forum. I like the name and picked it for myself. I also wanted to brief the people who are with us in London, at the London School of Economics. And in case you can't see them, they're sitting there inside that computer. Are there many people? I only see one person there. Oh, well, there's a person they're joining the School of Economics. Anyway. But in a way, symbolically, and here's our associate dean, former associate dean, board member, Becky Avila. Baum had the idea of having this conversation really, in large part, so that instead of having a lunch just for our fellows and faculty and ourselves and our board members, that we would really extend this particularly to undergraduates and graduate students, as well as faculty who are involved or might want to become involved with our project, because the fact is that we think of our center, as is true of many of the centers around the Annenberg School, as being involved in very exciting research that is made much better by the engagement of students. And so if we wind up picking up 2 or 3 or 4 students who previously weren't engaged in work that we're doing, that would be a real plus. And if we're able to sort of showcase some of the exciting work that some students are doing here, which you will hear in a minute, that would be a real plus. Many of you know Mark Latonero, who got his PhD here in communications and would theoretically be teaching at Fullerton, but isn't, because he's spending this year with us and continues as our research director. And so to lead this forum, to introduce the fellows and speakers today, I'm really pleased to welcome Mark Latonero.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me say a couple words about the research mission of CCLP. Our mission is to lead on critical issues in media, communication, and policy through convening and publishing significant research on the pressing social concerns both nationally and globally. We focus our research in areas such as technology and social change, media and democracy, civic discourse, and the future of news. And we seek to impact understanding and action for academic, policy, and public audiences. So in essence, our aim is to produce research that makes a difference. And that's what unites the broad range of research we're going to be talking about today, from human trafficking to public diplomacy, from online community news, and to Reagan's legacy. At the center, we have a stellar group of staff, graduate researchers, and fellows who comprise the engine which drives our research. We have John Raby, over there, our graduate fellow, who is an MA student in our joint LSC Annenberg Global program. He's working on civic discourse. And Ganet Berhana, our law fellow, who is a recent graduate of Vanderbilt Law School. And we also have a number of distinguished fellows, senior fellows, many of whom I see here at the table. And so in a few minutes, we're going to spotlight some of the research projects on our agenda. But before I do, I would like to acknowledge some of the fellows who are here today. And if you would, maybe just say a couple of words about what you're working on. And let me just say that each of these fellows could probably do, and they often do, a whole keynote at events. But let me just say, if you can keep it to maybe 1 minute, I'd appreciate it. And also, let me just say at the outset and reiterate what Jeff said, that I would particularly encourage students in the room to make note if any of these projects that you hear today might be of interest to you and is something you might want to get involved with. And I think we have a sign-up sheet for students who want to learn more about how to get involved. Narda Zakino, at the table, is a senior fellow at our center. She is an author and a award-winning journalist who's served as a top editor of the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and other publications. Narda, do you want to say just a couple words about your current book project?
Sure. I am writing a book about Whatever Happened to California, is the working title. We all sort of know what happened. I think I'm exploring how and why it happened, and what we're going to be doing in the future. So it's gotten a lot more exciting since Jerry Brown has been elected to his second administration. So his first and his second administrations will book in my book.
Excellent. And our newest senior fellow is Mark Winograd, who, among other policy posts, was a former senior policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore. He's author of a new book on The Millennial Generation, Social Media and Politics. Morley, do you want to say a few words about your book?
Thank you, Mark, and I'll try and keep it to a minute. The new book is called Millennial Momentum, How a New Generation is Remaking America. It'll be out in the fall. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about it in this kind of forum soon. It basically continues the conversation and analysis and research, using a lot of survey research, on the impact the millennial generation is having, but that we had in our first book on Millennial Makeover. But it takes that technological and generational perspective broader than the political dimension and explores how it's changing America, the way America lives and works, governs and educates itself.
Thanks, Morley. And next we have Jack, a senior fellow and also a professor at the USC Gould School of Law and director of the USC Intellectual Property and Technology Law Clinic. Jack, do you want to take a minute or minute and a half?
Sure. So I have two projects that the folks here might find interesting. The first one is working with Mark and Jeff down in Cowan, which is a fair use resource center. We do an online community and resource center for people interested in fair use across all the doctrine of fair use and copyright across all sectors of society. And as fair use has gotten to be more important in our copyright system, the need for education and understanding of this doctrine, how it works, and how it can be made to work more practically has become more important. So we're putting this together and expect to launch within 2 months. I'm also working with Jean Overholzer, who's here to my left, on a project in conjunction with a bunch of journalism schools around the country to explore what legal protections and legal challenges that journalism schools face in doing journalism. And so it's everything from, if you're a public institution, you have to worry about being FOIA'd, as William Cronin now does, or what kind of spot guidance do you need and do you have access to in a journalism setting. And so again, as the face of journalism changes, we think that journalism schools will become more important in the newsmaking process and investigative reporting. And as a result, we need to have a ducks in a row. So that's what two things I'm working on that I hope to share more about with you.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, thank you all, and high five. And now on to our program. Jeremy Curtin is on the phone. Jeremy, are you at the State Department now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, he's at the State Department where until recently he was head of the Bureau of International Information Programs. And where recently he was also our government's senior public diplomacy officer. Jeremy has 30 years in the Foreign Service, specializing in international public affairs and strategic communications. Jeremy is involved in a number of projects here at CCLP. Jeremy, can you take 3 or 4 minutes or so to share some of the highlights of your latest report in conjunction with the Stimson Center on the challenges of public diplomacy in the 21st century?
Yes, I was given 2 minutes before, so I'm getting better, I guess. I have 4 minutes. I undertook a research project for the Stimson Center here in Washington and the American Academy of Diplomacy to look at training of our Foreign Service and the skills and education, knowledge needed for 21st century diplomacy. So it wasn't just public diplomacy, it was all the practice of diplomacy in the 21st century. And the question was, what skills and knowledge do we need and how do we get them? This report came at a time when diplomacy was under great challenge from the militarization of our international relations after 9/11 and the very great imbalance in resources dedicated to civilian power as opposed to military power, which there's so much discussion about these days. It is also, though, at the same time, a growing consensus that proliferating political and humanitarian trouble spots really require diplomatic and development responses, not military intervention. So we interviewed a lot of people in the State Department, DOD, think tanks, and others, and we came to 2 conclusions. One was the role of diplomacy fundamentally, is unchanged. That is, our diplomats implement U.S. foreign policy abroad and help formulate foreign policy in Washington. So that hasn't changed, but the details of how we implement the policy have changed. There are far more players. We deal with NGOs. We have to take into account terrorists, not just states. The number of agencies operating overseas has exploded to more than 60 nowadays. 50% of our 50% of our foreign service posts are now hardship posts, so the conditions under which we operate are more dangerous and more difficult than in the past. Public diplomacy is changing the matrix of diplomacy writ large, and then new information technology is changing the way we do our daily work in this increasingly networked world. So that's the context, and we came to the conclusion that in spite of all these changes, the necessary skills remain pretty much the same. The fundamental skills, leadership, adaptability, strong language skills, and knowledge of other cultures. But we also need to understand how to operate in this highly complex interagency community, how to engage the wide range of non-traditional interlocutors, and we had to understand better the new knowledge we needed in order to operate on regional and global issues as well as bilateral issues. So the fundamental requirements are the same, but we needed to know more about more things. The clear, not very surprising conclusion is that training is essential for both the traditional and the new skills. And training requires funding and people. That was the advocacy point that we arrived at. It's the main conclusion. It was particularly important because the Foreign Service has a long reputation for not valuing training. So we recommended certain new training requirements for promotion throughout the service and for the senior Foreign Service. Unfortunately, this report comes out, maybe not unfortunate, maybe it's just more necessary, but comes at a time when Congress is trying to cut the federal budget, including the international affairs budget, as we've seen the last few days. We have a strong Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, but even she's having a hard time trying to maintain our funding, let alone increasing it. So this report gets into the mix of all the arguments about funding our international affairs apparatus. I'll just end on the point is I think that people who are interested in foreign policy, the way we run our foreign policy apparatus, and interested in the Foreign Service would find this report interesting too, just as a description of our professional Foreign Service and an analysis of the dynamics of current foreign relations that we're dealing with these days. So that's what I was up to. The report is finished. It's on the website of the American Academy of Diplomacy, and I think also the CCLP website.
And it's also on the table here for people to pick up if they'd like. We'll reserve questions for the end, and that's the reason why I'm being such a taskmaster on time, so we can have questions at the end. But thanks, Jeremy.
Sure.
Okay, I mentioned that involving students was an integral part of what we do at CCLP, and this has been especially true in our Technology and Trafficking in Persons project, which Jeremy played a significant and a major role in, and he continues to do. So I'll turn to that project now. The Technology and Trafficking in Persons project grew out of a meeting in June of 2010 that Jeff convened in Washington, D.C., with Alec Ross, who is Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's Senior Advisor for Innovation. Alec Ross had asked Jeff if CCLP could help apply technology to some of the State Department's foreign policy concerns, human trafficking being a top priority. Jeff and Jeremy brought together a working group that included Ambassador Lou DeBaca, who is the head of the Department of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. People
He's
from
the one in the center there.
Yep, and there's Alec Ross to the left of him, and also in the room were representatives of USAID, Department of Justice, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, leaders from Silicon Valley, so our tech component, and top anti-trafficking NGOs. The participants identified several key communication problems and possible technological solutions for those. And a major idea which came from the meeting was to develop technologies to link international anti-trafficking efforts with those efforts, particularly in Southeast Asia, with domestic efforts, particularly in California. In August of 2010, CCLP organized a field research team to Southeast Asia, which was me, and Erin Kamler, who was here at the table, who at the time was a CPD MA student and is now one of Larry's doctoral students. And we chose the Mekong subregion because at the meeting it was identified as one of the largest sources of, it very well may be the largest source of trafficked women and children in the world. And we chose Thailand and Cambodia, countries that are both major source, transit, and destination centers for men, women, and children who are forced into labor and prostitution. Erin, do you want to give a brief summary of what we found?
Sure. So on this trip, Mark and I met with more than 15 organizations involved in anti-trafficking efforts and initiatives, including U.S. embassies, UN, USAID, large NGOs, international NGOs like World Vision, and also small local NGOs provide shelter for rescued victims of forced prostitution. And while many of these organizations are doing excellent work, we found that a very chaotic landscape of ineffective and inefficient communication processes exists. And this makes coordination of anti-trafficking efforts a vastly complex problem in the region. So basically, an informal and an ad hoc process of information sharing currently characterizes NGO and service provider communications in the region. The NGOs operate primarily through a close network of personal relation-based connections with little communication outside of these networks. And in addition, victims possess limited ways to communicate with service providers. Finally, we found that a lack of information sharing about trafficking cases among organizations with common interest existed. So it's very complex, very chaotic, fascinating study.
And so, as with many attempts of trying to apply technology for human rights or IC, information and communication technology for development, the social issues that Erin described are much more of the challenge than the technological issues, actually. Yet our research leads us to believe that the right technology is applied in a very focused way could make a significant contribution in this arena, particularly in terms of data collection, sort of filling in the information gap, as it were, and increasing global and local communication flows between anti-trafficking groups. Now, we continue to learn lessons from the anti-trafficking efforts in Southeast Asia. Just 2 weeks ago, we dispatched Jaleh Boyd, yes, Team 2, who is a master's student at the Center for Public Diplomacy, back to the Mekong subregion to strengthen our partnerships there. And Jaleh has actually been doing some excellent work developing relationships here in California. Jaleh, do you want to talk a bit?
Yeah, so thank you, Mark. Hi, everybody. So in Vietnam, my findings on communication were similar to what Mark and Erin found, but I also found that for a variety of reasons, it would be really difficult to apply an outside model to Vietnam. And I also found that any kind of blanket program for the whole Mekong subregion would be similarly difficult without taking into account the unique circumstances of countries like Vietnam and Myanmar, but particularly from my research, Vietnam. So we're still developing this research and figuring out how we can apply this project to what's going on there. The other project I'm working on is in conjunction with a class that I'm taking here at Annenberg called Research Practice and Social Change with Professor Balrokeach and Professor Osborne. And it really is an amazing class. But the point of the class is to try to connect the academic realm with the practical, practice realm. And so I'm working on linking CCLP with the LA Metro Task Force on Human Trafficking. And several task force affiliates have come on board with this project we have going on with ISI that Mark will go into in detail in a moment. And we're having our first joint meeting next week, which is really exciting.
Let me just add that Jaleh is a Pickering Fellow who will be starting her Foreign Service training at the Department of State this summer. Okay. And so we're putting the relationships that Jaleh has forged into the next phase of our project, which I'll end with today. Jeff and CCLP were awarded a grant from the Annenberg Program on Online Communities, APOC, to understand the extent to which social networks like Twitter, Facebook, and MySpace, and online advertising like Craigslist are being used for trafficking, and how those same social networks can connect domestic and international anti-trafficking efforts. On this team are Ganet Berhana, our law fellow, Reagan Smith, MA student in communication, Ashley Hernandez, where's Ashley? Ashley with the LSE people, an MA student in SPPD, and Lauren Movius, a doctoral candidate. And our team has gathered from the literature a lot of evidence which says that social networks are used to facilitate trafficking. But no one has done any empirical work with any credible social science methods to understand the issue. So the objective of this study is to fill the information gap that has emerged concerning communication, concerning human trafficking behavior online, and to inform policy and action on the use of social media for monitoring and combating trafficking. And to this end, CCLP has teamed up with computer scientists at the Viterbi School, at the Information Sciences Institute in Marina del Rey, who are experts in natural language processing and analysis of large corpus data sets, and who have developed certain surveillance technologies for the Department of Homeland Security that we're repurposing, let's just say, for our study. And we're using those technologies to see if we can measure evidence of human trafficking online, particularly the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So right now we're in the data collection phase. We're measuring the prevalence of keywords on social media. We're mapping possible trafficking cases through geolocation and creating an interface that, that can make that available, make that information available to people and positioned to help. And on Tuesday of next week, I'm excited to report that we are demonstrating the interface and the initial results at the Information Sciences Institute with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the Los Angeles Police Department. So maybe we'll have another research roundtable to talk about those results. But it's time to move on. And our next speaker is our senior fellow, actually our executive in residence, Jeff Klein. Jeff has spent 15 years in senior management at the Los Angeles Times, among other business ventures, and teaches here in our journalism school. Jeff has just completed a case study of online community news at the Long Beach Post, and I should mention that this report was co-authored with Maria Vasquez, a doctoral student in communication who was visiting us last summer from the University of Nevada in Spain. So Jeff, do you want to tell us what you and Maria learned?
Great, thanks, Mark. So, in the early 90s, when I was president of the Los Angeles Times Valley edition, we had almost 100 journalists covering the San Fernando Valley at the LA Times. Today, I don't think there's one located in the valley. The plant and the offices are closed, they're shuttered. When Narda Zucchino, around that time, was the editor of the Orange County edition, there were almost 200 journalists in the Orange County edition covering local news. Today, my guess is, I don't know for sure, but probably, 2. I was going to say under 10. Wow. I was in the Orange County facility last year, and it was like a ghost town. In fact, there were more journalists who worked for an online community news site that was subleasing space in the old LA Times newsroom than there were LA Times journalists. It's against this backdrop that we decided to look at the emergence of online community news websites. And in the class I teach in the communication management program, we use cases a lot. We use case studies. We look at cases, we look at Netflix, we look at Google, we look at Politico.com, but there weren't any cases that I could find on community news websites. It was a relatively recent phenomenon. So we decided to try and find a community news website that was a for-profit website, not a non-profit, that was sustainable and had been around for a while. And we found one in Long Beach, California, called the Long Beach Post, that was launched in 2006. It was launched by two guys, Sean Lumachi and Robert Garcia. They were in their late 20s. Sean was not a journalist. Robert was a journalism student. Robert actually got a master's degree here at USC. They wanted to cover Long Beach.
David Westfall, who's now running a terrific program on health journalism, did a lot of work with the center last year, bringing together those websites. And we actually had a meeting of them, looking at what were their common themes and what were their differences. But we all realize this is the future, a kind of future that's happening, and yet it really hasn't been studied. And the terrific work that Geoffrey had done is to really present, I think, in this quite cogent paper, the first case study, which we think will be used around the country as a way of understanding this phenomenon. We hope we'll be able to develop more such case studies so we really can understand more about how this works. Why don't we go on to Reeves
Sure.
and then come back with Jeff.
Sure, and I should say that Jeff's study is on the table, also with a teaching guide. Richard? Well, we all might know Richard, actually. As an award-winning presidential biographer.
We've got a person at the London School of Economics who wants to know more about it.
Okay. Well, you might know Richard as an award-winning presidential biographer, his reporting at the New York Times or Esquire, or as a historian. However, you might not know that Richard Reeves started out as an aspiring engineer. And the reason why I know that is because Richard mentioned this when he was a guest at one of our weekly lunches that the graduate researchers organized for a freewheeling discussion of ideas.
By the way, for those of you who do decide to become involved with us, Mark runs these weekly conversations with researchers and fellows.
So Richard wrote a piece for the Reagan Centennial, and Richard, do you want to talk about what you learned about?
Yes, it was punishment for my sin. I was an aspiring engineer. I was an engineer. I did graduate and work at it. Himself, as Jeff Cowan is known among the Irish, was in charge of the USC part of a pie of 5 universities who were going to evaluate, in conjunction with the Reagan Library, the legacy of Ronald Reagan on the anniversary of his 100th birthday. Obviously, the library, to say the least, that was our program there. The library, to say the least, picked most of the panelists, and they were, to say the least, adoring of the president. I don't know whether I say Nancy Reagan and I get along. She liked me, even though I was a political opponent, and generally liked the biography I wrote, Ronald Reagan, The Triumph of Imagination, in 1995. So I wasn't sure why I was there, but I certainly learned a good deal about the building of presidential legacy, which really, at least in our memory, began with John Kennedy and Camelot. Reagan, with probably better tools, expanded on that to the point which I explored for the paper. When Ronald Reagan left office, he had a fairly good, very good approval rating of 63%. That is, people liked him, or they liked the fact that he was leaving. And, but he was considered a tired old man, particularly by his own people, who were terrified that he was giving away the country to the commies and their new young brash leader, President Gorbachev. As it turned out, they were totally wrong. Journalists write books about presidents while they are in office that are invariably negative. And when the presidents leave office, journalists forget all about them. And they move on to trash new politicians. Reagan was extremely lucky, though, that his first and probably still definitive biographer, a member of the faculty here, Luke Cannon set both a very high and very fair bar in considering a figure who was controversial, to say the least. So things went along with people thinking, many people thinking, oh, thank God he's not there anymore, and others thinking, well, he survived and we survived, so it's okay. In July of 1997, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Put out one of his surveys of historians, 719 historians, on how they ranked the presidents. Reagan ranked 25, just behind Rutherford B. Hayes. Conservatives in the country were in a rage about this, and most particularly, I'll read you what the magazine of the Heritage Foundation said at that time. Their cover when that came out was "Reagan Betrayed, Are Conservatives Fumbling His Legacy?" A noted conservative, Grover Norquist, the head of the Americans for Tax Reform, went dippy-doo about this and formed something called the Reagan Legacy Project. The Reagan Legacy Project is an effort to memorialize the spirit and achievements of the nation's greatest president, Ronald Wilson Reagan. The Reagan Project aims to fulfill its mission, which was to put a monument to Ronald Reagan in every county, 2,600 counties in the United States. So far, they've gotten about 100 of it. But there is no doubt that this Reagan Legacy Project has been an enormous success. And it received a boost, a deserved boost. Though I was a political opponent of his, the reason I wrote a book on him is I realized he was a much more significant president than we thought he was when he was in office. And a little later than that, he got a tremendous boost when Marty and Annalise Anderson up at Stanford, the Hoover Institution. Hoover Institution is kind of an old age home for Republicans. And they evaluated the Reagan record from their viewpoint. They concluded that he had reached the top four. The four greatest presidents in American history were George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. And they based that on 4 pillars, all of them a little shaky. One, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. 2, Ronald Reagan reduced federal taxes, and his policies led to the subsequent boom in the American economy in the 1980s. 3, Ronald Reagan reduced the size of government. 4, Ronald Reagan restored America's faith in themselves and in their government. This is the man who said government is not the solution, government is the problem. But apparently, according to the Andersons, he restored faith in government. There's something wrong with all of those 4 points, which I mentioned to a bit of a chill in this presentation. But the Andersons' book, in his own words, which was based on the radio commentaries he gave over 20 years, made it clear that Reagan was not the dope many of us had pictured him as or believed he was. He, in fact, Ronald Reagan was an intellectual. By that, I mean he saw the world in terms of ideas. He was a grumpy old man who knew what he knew, thought he knew what he needed to know, and didn't want to hear anything new. He also was beyond flattery. Presidents who are beyond flattery, Eisenhower being a case, older presidents who have achieved things before, are much less vulnerable to flattery, which is a great danger in the presidency than the younger presidents who are lusting after history did. In fact, Ronald Reagan did not win the Cold War. We can talk about that, although he acted very wisely. during the Cold War, saw the opportunity, had always seen the Soviet Union as destined to fail because of its internal contradictions. The people around him, the Richard Pearls and Paul Wolfowitzes of the world, did everything they could to keep him away from Gorbachev because they thought Gorbachev would keep him alive. As to his economic policies, he made his name by attacking tax and spend Democrats and then invented borrow and spend Republicans, which is who we have been living under in recent times. Federal spending went up 3% a year during his presidency, and the federal employees went up by 500,000 people. But the reason Grover Norquist was there, and I think the reason we were there, was because the Republican Party needs and needed Ronald Reagan, and they need him right now. I want to read something that I wrote in 1984 at the Republican National Convention, which I covered for the New York Times magazine. A more accurate model of the Republican Party, it seemed to me, looked like an atom, a series of whirling concentric circles around the electromagnetic nucleus named Reagan. The first ring close to the center, but not very wide, was the Reaganites. The group included the White House staff and Vice President Bush. The next two rings were the pragmatists, the traditionalists, and the old right. These included most of the party's congressional leadership, beginning with Senators Howard Baker and Robert Dole. Circling them from the new right was a group from Jack Kemp to Newt Gingrich, who saw themselves as the new populists, not only opposed to big government, but also to the country club elitists of older conservatives. There were three wildlier orbits, which included moderates, the religious right, which was not as strong then as now, and the crazies, many of whom they would be called Tea Partiers today, but they were known as libertarians then. I assumed that when Reagan left, the nucleus would come out of that atom and the whole thing would collapse. That has not happened. I was wrong about that, and the reason it hasn't happened is that the Republican Party, for all the fact that everyone looks alike, is deeply divided into groups, even more so than when Reagan left office. And the only thing they all agree on is Ronald Reagan. It's as if he were still the leader of the Republican Party, and in many days was still a president of the United States. I then finished, to even colder applause, by going into the effects of his economic legacy and his view, repeated by Dick Cheney, that deficits don't matter. Ronald Reagan proved that. The other thing was the Great Communicator was so good at communicating that he could take very complex situations and ideas and get large people to understand them. Or you could say he dumbed down America. And I prefer the latter. That's where I finished, and I guess I was the last speaker. People were quite surprised. We were in the Reagan Library after all. Right. And I bumped into one of the archivists there. I love the archivist. And she said, "You've got a lot of balls." So that was my work piece.
They still sent us a big box of jelly beans, which we brought today.
I'd be careful.
I think we assembled a panel with the diversity of views on it, and
You must tell the Brokaw story.
well, how Brokaw walked into the room.
Yeah.
I mean, the most amazing thing was people were in this Reagan, you can see us on the stage, but people were, several hundred people were there. Many of them had gotten their way in advance. And people, and this was an important event because I think people wanted the topic generally Reagan, Tom Brokaw, who people were very anxious to see, of course, the Reeves groupies who were there.
Both of them.
Governor Wilson. It was quite an impressive group of people who were on the panel. Lou Cannon, who Dick just mentioned. But they had to wait for about 20 minutes before the thing
45
started.
minutes.
45 minutes. 45 minutes.
Who's counting?
But they were so polite. First of all, I have to say they were totally polite during this whole time. And the word went out that it was because, after all, this was a time, there was a snowstorm in the east, and Tom Brokaw was getting there through the snow because this was such an important thing. And by the way, Peggy Noonan, who was supposed to be on the panel, had missed it because of the snowstorm. And so people were very polite. Tom comes in and sits down, and he's beyond charming. He has a lot of the qualities that Reagan had in that sense. He was so charming. Let me tell you about lunch. Nancy Reagan had just asked him to have lunch with her. So the reason he was late was he'd had a long lunch with Nancy Reagan.
They all went.
So he said, now Nancy Reagan said, since I was coming, but she'd want to bring one other friend there. And this would surprise people in the audience who imagine if she's going to have somebody here, it's going to be, she's going to find John Wayne, pull him out of the ground or something, or maybe Clint Eastwood. But it was Warren Beatty, who of course is known as a very progressive Democrat. So the two guys that she wanted to have lunch with were Tom Brokaw and Warren Beatty.
Well, the way Tom told the story was, she said, "Would you have lunch? I can't go up there. I'm not feeling well enough. Will you have lunch with me though before you go?" And Tom said, "Of course." And she said, "And bring anybody you want." And Tom said, you bring anybody you want. Bring Warren Beatty, bring whoever you want. And Tom said, "You and I don't need other people. It'll be fine." The next morning, as Tom was woken by a phone call, Nancy Reagan was on and said, "Tom, I think you misunderstood something that I said yesterday." And he said, "What was that?" She said, bring Warren Beatty."
I think the only more surprising thing was she said, and by the way, don't forget about Sean Penn. Anyway, let's have a discussion about all this. And particularly, I'd love to have students join in this discussion, ask questions of these scholars or other students. How do you get to go to the Mekong Delta on our nickel? Whatever it is you want to ask about. And I just want to underline this last thing. We are in a great school, the Annenberg School. And we have terrific classes. We have great faculty. But as this panel, I think, has begun to indicate, we do impactful research that makes a difference in the world. And I think that's something that we can all be really proud of, and we can offer those opportunities for students, not just for the people in the panel, but throughout the school. So who would like to either make an assertion, come defend Ronald Reagan, or ask questions about trafficking or about community journalism or whatever? Anybody want to get into this? Richie. And Richie, by the way, is a student who's been working with us.
How would I, as an undergraduate, I know I work at the center and I have access to, but how would other undergraduates get to you? Would you prefer that they email you, or would you rather, because you all have very fascinating things and you all very important people.
So let's answer that question from the standpoint of our center. But I want to say to how many, could I have undergraduates put up your hands? How many undergraduates do we have here? Something that undergraduates often don't realize is that teachers are here not just to go into the classroom and teach. They actually like getting to know and working with undergraduates. They have office hours not because they're required to, because they're actually hoping somebody will come in and talk to them. and not talking about a problem they're having on their exam, but hopefully talking about something that interests them, or what their faculty members are working on. So the first thing I would say, Richie, is take classes with faculty who interest you, and go and get to know those faculty members and see if they're working on something that's exciting. You are in a terrific place with great faculty working on great projects who welcome it. But Mark, do you want to answer more specifically the question that she asked?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities, particularly in, well, there are the Cowan Scholars, who are a group of motivated undergrads who come together on a regular basis and talk about issues in terms of policy and communication. And Jeff, weren't you just at a dinner?
Yeah, but I mean, I think for people who want to do this kind of research, you can email. Do we have it up here, Jeff? We just put the.
We actually do have a sign-up sheet.
Or a sign-up
yeah.
sheet. Please sign up and come participate in these things and pick and choose. And we've only listed a few. Again, there are a lot of great places around the school that are doing exciting work. But we have these several exciting projects, and some others. NARDA's project that she mentions, Morley's work, which is wonderful. Jack Lerner's projects that he talked about. We have a lot of exciting things going on, and many things that we didn't mention.
I see the sign-up sheet going around too.
Okay, so that's thank you, Richie, for that prompted question. And you have to ask a prompted question. Anybody else with something there doesn't have to be a student.
Then you get to go to the meet college.
Can I ask across the table, in either of your projects, either the follow-up Vietnam version or the original one, to what degree do you attribute the trafficking to government corruption and compliance and coordination?
Do you want to go first?
Attribute trafficking as a problem to government?
No, as they're involved at the level of state government or local government.
Well, in Thailand specifically, the government has tried to start complying with the U.S. TIP office, trafficking persons office protocols and requirements for every country. The TIP office puts out an annual report that basically analyzes all the countries in the world, including the U.S., and sort of assesses whether the countries are meeting the standards. You know, Thailand has been attempting to become a Tier 1 country, which the U.S. is and many other countries in the West are. However, they're still at a Tier 2. And so part of that does relate to, of course, government corruption and police corruption particularly. And in Cambodia, that issue is much more, even, I think, deeper ingrained into the system and the fabric of how the government works.
And in Vietnam, I think right now they're in a really interesting transition period where the government's really stepping up its anti-trafficking game. They're getting ready to release, I don't know if they've actually released it yet or not. It was slated to be released a week ago, a new national plan of action, which is really ambitious and really works closely with UNIAP and the IOM, and also the Asia Foundation. But the corruption is really intense, but it's on the local level, the local governments, especially in the border regions. And a lot of the time, law enforcement is really, I think, an issue that is going to be more difficult to address.
Can I ask a question about that? Is their definition of corruption the same as ours?
From my understanding, it is. I actually wasn't in the border region. This is from talking to people who work in the border region. So my information was maybe 2 people removed. But it has to do with bribes, embezzling of funds that were earmarked for programs, anti-trafficking programs in the region, and also government employees directly being involved in trafficking, like being traffickers themselves.
There's also just a lot of looking for
Right.
not making this an important priority, I think, sort of on a cultural level as well as political.
That's what I meant, really. Is how much of, in that country and in others, is it cultural?
A huge amount in some places. I also went to Haiti in November, studying technology usage in camps and shelters. And certain mobile phones are being used to alert people in the community about gender-based violence. But the trafficking problem, specifically forced labor of kids, is an ingrained issue in Haitian culture, some parts of Haitian culture, where the poor of the rural areas who aren't able to be fed by their families, or the families essentially give some of these kids to urban dwellers and houses there to clean and do chores without pay, but just for food. Technically, that is human trafficking, according to the State Department, but it's called Restavik, I think. It is an ingrained cultural, it's ingrained in the cultural fabric.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, just before we break, because I think we're just about at the 1 o'clock hour, I wanted to announce, so next year, during the academic year, we're going to continue a series of dialogues on issues related to research and also politics. And in partnership with the Unruh Institute and the Bedrosian Center, we'll be having a weekly program that we're calling Road to the White House 2012, Politics, Technology, and Society. And we, as our center, every 3 weeks will be putting together a similar, singular focus on a topic related to one of these issues.
So this room is in such tremendous demand, I think, because of its name.
Perhaps it's a case.
But the library is a fabulous place. It's a wonderful room library, and we really do urge you to come. And Jeff will be sending out. We'll send a lot of publicity about it. I want to thank Jeff for putting this together, Mark for running this wonderful panel, and our terrific group of fellows and students who have been part of the research this year. It's been a very exciting year, and we're looking forward to an even more exciting year. Thank you.
Thank you.